Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Introduction to the Code of Fundraising. My name is Katie Docherty and I'm the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising. And I'm joined today by Conor Gibson, Policy Manager for the Fundraising Regulator. But before we begin, I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping arrangements. We're absolutely delighted that we have over 1,000 attendees registered today. So if you have questions, please can I ask you to submit these through the Q&A function tab at the bottom of the screen and not in the chat. However, if you're having any technical issues, please post that in the chat and one of my colleagues will reach out to help. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand afterwards. Conor's presentation will be available on YouTube and the full webinar will be available to members via your member account. After the webinar, you'll receive a short survey asking for feedback on the code, so please do take time to fill that in. So on to our webinar. At the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, we are pleased to see the code revised. In this challenging fundraising environment, it is essential that regulation is up to date, accessible, and enables best practice so that charities, large and small, can fundraise to the highest standards. And that so many of you have joined today is testament to your commitment to that. This more streamlined principles-based code marks a significant shift in fundraising regulation, which allows many charities both opportunities and challenges. And it's therefore essential that you have the opportunity to get your questions answered so that together we can enter this new phase of regulation with confidence. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by Conor Gibson, Policy Manager at the Fundraising Regulator, who's going to give you an overview of how the code has changed and then answer your questions. So just to remind you, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A function and we look forward to answering them after the presentation. So Conor, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Katie. So as you've heard, I'm the policy manager at the Fundraising Regulator. I led the project to redraft the code, and so I'm now going to take you through an outline of the work that we did as part of the code review process, which might be familiar to a lot of you who may have come to these sessions before. And then I'm going to explain how we redrafted the code based on the feedback that we received. And then I'm going to discuss a few examples of the principles-based approach in practice and what that looks like. So first off, the code review itself, it was an exhaustive and fairly extensive process. It started in autumn of 2022 with our call for information, where we heard from mostly sort of larger organizations and membership bodies, people who would be familiar with the code in its entirety, that would know all the many aspects that are involved in the code itself and give us their insights on what they think could be improved, what should be changed. They were generally in favor of the ideas of streamlining the code, moving more towards principles, and also making it clearer how you present legal information that exists in the 2019 code, and being clear about who actually is responsible for dealing with those issues where the law is involved. In autumn of 2023, we then went out for a full consultation with the sector on the proposals that we put together for every single one of the 430 something rules in the 2019 code, that we would either retain it, revise it, or remove it. And we got strong response there. We got over 130 organizations submitting responses, about 150,000 words worth of feedback. And we used that feedback to start work on redrafting the code and developing a fully redrafted version of the code, which we then took out for consultation in the autumn of 2024. Again, over 130 organizations got back to us with feedback on that. We also had some other engagement outside with key stakeholders and other ways that people could let us know what they thought. And those insights helped us complete the final code redrafting, which I'll talk a little bit about that process in a later slide. But essentially, that's helped us get from the autumn of 2024 to spring of 2025. The end of April, we launched the finalized 2025 code, which is available on the website in the PDF format. And we're now in a implementation period, which I'll discuss a little more later, with the code coming into effect on the 1st of November 2025. So I'll go through the key changes that will be in the code, people who are familiar with the 2019 code, the existing code, and the new code. One of the biggest changes is we've removed where we have rules that relate to legal requirements. This is often indicated with a bold must in the 2019 code, but it's not always clear what the law is that is the basis of that rule, and it potentially gives the impression that these are areas where the fundraising regulator is able to intervene when in fact there is another lead regulator who covers that area. So the legal information doesn't exist within rules anymore, but the most significant aspects that relate to fundraising are contained within the code in summaries. I'll show you one of those later on as well. And we direct readers to where they can find the most up-to-date and most relevant information from the lead regulator. So, for example, the Information Commissioner's Office in terms of data protection, Gambling Commission for lotteries, a lot of aspects like this where we had rules in the 2019 code that tried to explain how the law applied in the language of our code, but that weren't necessarily the most helpful or the most useful way of presenting that information. We've introduced a few new rules. I'll be going through these in detail later on in the presentation, but they're on aspects like engaging with the fundraising regulator to make sure that we have an effective self-regulatory system in place, protections for fundraisers from harm and harassment, and then a selection of rules relating to what we call convenience giving and unstaffed collections. As I say, I'll be talking about that in more detail later on. But the big impact is that this streamlining effort, this reduction of prescriptive rules and removal of rules that relate to legal information outside our remit means that there's now 70% fewer rules in the code, and it's almost half the length that it was. There's 45% fewer words in the new code than there was in the previous one. So hopefully it'll be more accessible and more easily understandable for people who are already familiar with the 2019 code and people who are coming to the code for the first time with the new version. The redrafting process, this is just to let you know how we reached our decisions. We reviewed every single consultation response was reviewed by multiple human beings, and we considered the basis of the challenges that people presented and the evidence that they provided in their responses. Alongside the new code, we published a code consultation summary that kind of shows all the working behind what we did and how we made decisions about specific areas and why we might have said in a consultation, we want the rule to say this, and then as a response of the consultation summaries, we now say the consultation responses, we now say the rule should in fact say this and should cover that area. As well as the formal consultation mechanism, we did a lot of engagement with stakeholders. We had events like this, obviously, where people could feedback on the consultation proposals, but we also spoke to other related regulatory bodies, so the ICO, the Advertising Standards Authority, Gambling Commission, DCMS, and sector bodies such as the Chartered Institute, the Charity Retail Association, some legal representatives of charity law groups as well. And all the decisions that we reached on revising the code had to be approved by both our committees and the board at the Fundraising Regulator. And on those committees and on our board, we have people with frontline fundraising experience, some people who are still current fundraisers, some people who have got a wide variety of fundraising experience and are now in more senior fundraising roles. And we also had representation from the Chartered Institute and from the Scottish Fundraising Advisory Panel, where there were practitioners that were giving insights into the potential impact of changes to the rules or the approaches we should take. Once we'd settled on all the changes to the rules, it was subject to an extensive legal review from our lawyers, who were also involved in a lot of the drafting along the way. And finally, the Crystal Mark accreditation from the Plain English campaign. So the new code, the 2025 code, is written to the same standards of clarity as the 2019 code, which was also Crystal Mark accredited. Sorry. So alongside the PDF of the code at launch, we put out a number of other supporting documents. We have a table of changes, which will be very useful for people who know the 2019 code and want to think about how the new code will reflect the old rules, saying which rules are now covered by which new principles, which rules are completely unchanged, which rules have been replaced by signposting legislation. The consultation summary document that I told you about, which obviously will let you know how we reached the decisions that we reached. And then also of particular interest, these 3 code support guides, which are a new approach that we've taken, and it covers off 3 key topics of due diligence in fundraising, monitoring fundraising partnerships, and documenting fundraising decisions. These are some of the areas that we think were the most significant for people to be preparing for during the implementation period. And the code support guides, they offer guidelines, but not checklists. They're explaining the different ways in which you can effectively monitor fundraising partners, the ways that you can effectively conduct due diligence, and how you should appropriately document your decisions. But there's an understanding that these are not the only ways that it can be done, and that it may change depending on the size and nature and scale of the fundraising activity that you're conducting. So not every organization or every activity is going to need the same level of due diligence or the same level of monitoring, but it's to explain to you the different ways that that can be done and the things to consider whilst you're doing it. So some of the key themes that come out from that are partnerships, which is obviously an ongoing and important issue for, novel fundraising approaches and large campaigns. You need to develop partnerships for that. And also risk, which is something that is quite important to mitigate and address, and also something that you may need to bring to the attention of the trustees or the governing body of your organization, because they essentially have the ultimate responsibility for managing risk across the organization, particularly in the context and also in the context of fundraising. So I'm shortly show you some examples of these principles-based rules, but just to explain kind of why we went for the principles-based approach and what they look like and why they look like that. One benefit of a principles-based rule is it's future-proof, or to some extent future-proof, because it can apply to a range of different scenarios. You don't need to have a specific rule for every fundraising method explaining how you can demonstrate a behavior or how you can be open about your fundraising methods. It's a principle that can apply across a whole range of scenarios, and it means that fundraisers themselves are empowered to consider how a principle would apply in a new context, rather than wait for us to produce a new set of rules specifically about an emerging approach, or hosting online events during lockdown. You don't need to wait for us to write new rules on that. Instead, you can consider how the principles would apply in that context. Because there are fewer prescriptive rules, the code's also streamlined and easier to digest. But although there is a reduction in the number of rules, there is continuity in the protections that are offered to the public through the rules. There's one specific example I'll show you where we've changed one of the requirements in the code, but for the large part, anything that is prohibited under the current code is prohibited under the new code, and some of the protections have actually been extended because they apply to a wider range of contexts, or there's greater clarity over where the responsibility lies, so there isn't room for people to go into the detail of the rule and say, well, technically that doesn't apply to me. And they're often accompanied, but not always, by examples. These are sort of non-exhaustive lists of things that you should always do or things that you should never do in that context or to meet that principle. Those examples are not meant to represent everything that falls under the principle, but it is often useful for fundraisers and for the public to know things that are explicitly prohibited or that are always required, information you should always give or actions you should never take. But I think this will make more sense once we actually look at the examples of the new rules. So the first one to show you is these rules on persuasion and intrusion. The 2019 code has 4 rules that cover areas of how you kind of you could potentially go too far in asking somebody for funds. There's 4 rules there that are in 3 subsections of the code, split across 2 different parts, and we've turned that into, so just to be clear, I am going to zoom in on the actual rules so you can see that in a second. This is more the indicative information, but yeah, you get a single rule in one place that explains what the expectations are for behavior in that context. The one major change here is that the rule 1.1.2 in the 2019 code requires that you must be polite to people at all times. We actually considered that that requirement should be removed, and we included this in our proposals, consulted on it, because there is a risk that if you require people to be polite at all times, even whenever they're facing inappropriate or abusive behavior from people, then that just empowers the people who are behaving inappropriately. So we consider that the new rule can cover that off without putting fundraisers in a difficult situation where they would be breaching the code, but also responding appropriately to someone else's inappropriate behavior. So the new rule is focused more on reflecting positively, and it requires that you must take all reasonable steps to ensure your fundraising is conducted in a way that reflects positively on fundraising in general, and then includes non-exhaustive examples such as not unreasonably intruding on privacy, placing undue pressure to donate, being unreasonably persistent, and also that you would accept a request to end an interaction. So this rule applies across all aspects of fundraising, and so the requirement to accept a request to end an interaction is going to be there for whether you're talking to somebody in the street, whether you're knocking on somebody's door, whether you're talking to them on the telephone. We don't need different rules to cover that off. It's generally, it does not reflect positively on fundraising in general to reject somebody's request to end an interaction. And so therefore that's where the principle would apply, and it would fit across a range of fundraising methods and contexts. Another example to look at, this is a slightly unusual one, but an interesting one for you to see. On the left, we've got 5 rules that exist in the current code that talk about the obligations to act in the best interest of the charitable institution, make sure assets are used appropriately, that kind of thing. They've all got the bold must attached because they're linked to legislation. They're primarily linked to legislation like the Charities Act, that's under the remit of the Charity Commission rather than under our remit. And so we're not the best placed people to cover this area. But we did consider that there are, with regards to your fundraising activity, it's reasonable to expect people to be able to demonstrate they've acted in the best interest whilst conducting that fundraising activity. So what we've done instead is we've taken about 200 words in the current code and translated that into about areas that aren't necessarily in our remit, and we've translated that into a new principle specifically linked to fundraising practice, and that is accompanied by a link on our website to some information explaining what the legal responsibilities of governing bodies are. So we understand that it's useful for people to know what the legal responsibilities of, say, trustees are, but we don't think that it necessarily needs to sit within our code. So we can provide it in a more flexible, more useful, more updatable manner by linking it in the code rather than trying to contain it in the code. So the rule itself says that you must be able to show that you've acted in the best interest of your charitable institution when fundraising, and then includes, again, some non-exhaustive examples, dealing with conflicts of interest, making sure your donations are used for the purpose they're giving, and making sure that people fundraising on your behalf send the donations to the charitable institution. This rule is, whilst the previous rules were tied to legislation that would only apply primarily to registered charities in England and Wales, this rule will apply to governing bodies for registered charities, for social enterprises, for exempt charities, for KICs. They should all be ensuring that they've acted in the best interest of the charitable institution when fundraising. And by setting that expectation, which is specifically relating to the aspect of fundraising and how you're asking for funds, which is within the Fundraising Regulator's remit, we have a rule that we can effectively adjudicate on, and we're not setting an expectation, or we're not falsely setting an expectation for readers that all these other rules that are tied to your legal responsibilities are areas where we can take action or investigate. The final example I'm going to show you is was a potentially contentious area. It was about paying fundraisers. There was a lot of responses in the consultation about this. The 2019 code has 3 rules that go into quite a bit of detail and use terminology that could be potentially subjective or could potentially be misinterpreted or may not apply to the current context around payment of fundraisers and payment structures. So instead, we've come up with a single rule that applies across a range of contexts, which is that you must give appropriate consideration to the approach you choose for paying fundraisers and whether this fits the values of your charitable institution. So a single, much shorter rule that covers that off, that doesn't prohibit specific methods, that doesn't say that you shouldn't use this method or that you should always ensure that you use this method. But it does put the expectation on the charitable institution to be able to demonstrate that they've given consideration to that. It was informed as well by aspects of the market inquiry that we conducted that overlapped in part with the 2023 consultation, where we looked into subcontracting models and the risks involved in those. Through the market inquiry, we found that a lot of organizations are able to use commission payments effectively and responsibly to make sure that fundraisers get a fair deal. But we are conscious that there are risks involved, and there's an expectation that the charitable institution will consider how they can mitigate those risks and consider how that fits within their organizational values. This is a rule that will have an impact on potentially your partnerships with agencies or bodies that you work with to employ, say, street fundraisers as an example. So it's definitely worth considering that whenever you're thinking about what your organization can be doing during the implementation period. A couple more examples here. Just this is a quick one to show that in the old code, we had nearly 300 words explaining about gift aid, but all of them were about things that were that were outside our control, essentially that were within the remit of the of HMRC and are governed by HMRC. And so, whilst it is useful for fundraisers to know some things about gift aid, it's less useful for us to have 4 rules in 2 different sections of the code that set out as though these are standards that we would be adjudicating on. So instead, the new approach that we take is that we present this information all in one place in less than half as many words. We've outlined what gift aid is, and how it can effectively increase the amount of donation. We've explained that HMRC is the lead statutory body. We've included directions to where you can find more information from HMRC, where there's specific guidance on certain topics that you might want to follow. And this means that you will be able to see the most up-to-date information from the relevant lead regulator rather than some of the rules that we have that relate to legislation that use the bold must approach. That legislation has since changed, and we haven't been able to update it because we have quite a rigorous consultation process for updating our rules in the code. But what we can do instead now is, by leaving this information in the code because it is useful, but by not having it tied to a rule, if there is some new guidance from HMRC, we can add it to this. If there is some change in the law around gifted, we can update this much more flexibly than if we were tying it to our rules as we were doing previously. We've taken a similar approach for things like providing benefits with a donation, because again, that's a tax issue, for the requirements in ID badges, for marketing consent, and as with the responsibilities of trustees, we also have direct links from the code to pages on our website where we provide a summary and links to other resources about key legal topics like GDPR or running a charity lottery, because even though those areas aren't in our remit, we are aware that people coming to us might need to know something about it or might want to get a useful précis from us and directions to where they can find more information. So I'm just going to take you through a few of the new rules as well. Now, these are not all the new rules, but there are a few of them that will be of particular interest to you. Rule 2.1.2 relates to protecting fundraisers. This is an area that has come up throughout the consultation and that people have had a lot of opinions on, a lot of perspective on. But in general, there was significant support for the idea that we should have an expectation that there should be protections for fundraisers. Even in the time since we've been consulting on this, there's been more stories coming out about fundraiser well-being and about potential harm or harassment that fundraisers are facing. And so we appreciate that a charitable institution can't stop that happening, but they can address it or potentially mitigate it. And so the rule requires that you must take reasonable steps to protect fundraisers from harm and harassment while fundraising. And the two indicative examples, but not exhaustive examples, are that you would have a process for fundraisers to report issues that arise and that you would take reasonable steps to deal with any issues that are reported to you. So yeah, that is a change, and that's also has a knock-on effect, because if we had this rule and we also had the rule that said you must be polite at all times, they would contradict each other, so these have kind of fed into each other. There is an interconnection between the rules that are there. The other rule on this page is about engaging with the fundraising regulator. I alluded to that earlier as well, but it requires that you have to respond constructively and within an appropriate time to the inquiries that we would make or the Scottish Fundraising Advisory Panel would make, and also that you make sure that your partners are aware of and meet that standard as well. This is quite important to make the self-regulatory system an effective system and an efficient system. If there is somebody who is not engaging appropriately and not getting back to us, not providing information when it's asked for, not playing ball, then we could choose to say that they have broken this rule of the code, even if we can't tell if they've broken the other rules of the code. They've not engaged constructively with us. They're not cooperating with the self-regulatory system, and therefore we may choose to take some regulatory action against them in those circumstances. This rule is supported by a separate document that explains what our expectations are for engaging constructively, how we will contact you and how we expect you to respond, timeframes, things like that. So we won't just set standards that aren't clear to you on what we think is constructive engagement, but we may need at times to draw a line and say this organization is not engaging constructively and therefore they've breached that rule of the code. The final examples I'm going to show you are these on unstaffed collections. Essentially, these are fundraising methods where there isn't a fundraiser present. Sometimes there is a fundraiser present. It's a little bit of a gray area, but that's the simplest way to think about it, is that there isn't someone there that you can ask the question of well, where is the money going to? What's the organization do? How does this work? So that will be things like tap to donate machines, quite often QR codes, some text donation methods, a lot of static collections, collection bins, things like that. And what we want there is to set a baseline of information that should be provided to donors so that they can make an informed decision, and also to set a level playing field that regardless of what method of fundraising you're using, you'll provide a certain amount of information that will allow people to make a decision, and that everybody will be provided that. Everybody who's fundraising will be providing that baseline level of information. So the rule set out, the first rule is essentially what needs to be everywhere. If you're going to have an unstaffed collection point, then you need to make sure that there is clear, accurate, and up-to-date information about the collection, which includes the name of the charitable institution and their registration and contact details. So that's the baseline that's there. Also, if there's a third-party collector involved in the collection, it's quite often the case with charity bags, also with a lot of charity collection points these days, you have to include details of how the partners will be paid as part of the collection, and the contact details for the collector, if that's different from the contact details for the organization. Sorry. In addition to that, there is an expectation that you will also provide under Rule 7.5.2 an easy way for them to find details of processing fees involved in the donation and details of any secondary purpose for the donation. So I presume a lot of the people in the audience know what a secondary purpose is, but just for those who don't, if the classic example of if you're raising money to fix a church roof and it's going to cost £50,000, what happens if you raise £40,000, or what happens if you raise £80,000? What if you don't have enough money, or if you get too much money? What will happen to the funds that have been donated, and how will they be used? There's an understanding in this rule that if space is limited and it's not practical to include the information at the location, that you provide a short link to a web page containing those details. So it may not always be practical to spell all that information out on an isolated tap to donate machine in a far away corner of a bird sanctuary somewhere. But to be clear to people where they can find more information, and for it to be a convenient short link, not just the main website page, but website page / church roof collection, or whatever, anything that will get somebody to that information quickly and clearly, rather than just saying more information available or more information, see our website. But yeah, that's an aspect that might mean that a lot of the current collection points need to be updated and amended, but I'll get onto that in my final few slides. So in terms of what we as the Fundraising Regulator are doing next, we launched the code a few weeks ago, and we're now in our implementation and engagement period. During that time, we're going to limit the number of new investigations we conduct into the 2019 code, so that we can focus on priority areas and also make sure that we give plenty of attention to making sure everybody involved is ready for the new code's launch. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for engagement through sessions like this that you're coming along to, by providing feedback, hopefully at the end of the session, which we'll be able to take into consideration. And we'll use that feedback to shape some of the additional resources and how we present the information during the implementation period and beyond. So it is useful for us to see what you think of the code, and where are some areas of confusion or so where you think some additional support would be needed, and we can start work on some of that and find different ways to present that information. We already have some more guidance in the pipeline on topics including vulnerable circumstances, cashless donations, online gaming, social media, and events. So there is more guidance coming already, particularly that's going to be in the context of the new code and the new code rules. But we're hoping to respond to feedback and come up with ways that we can provide even more for you from there. And then from the 1st of November, the new code is the code. From the 1st of November, all fundraising activity that's being conducted that's subject to the code will be assessed under the new code. So the idea is that what you will do is get yourself ready for the 1st of November. And how you would do that is obviously, and hopefully a lot of you have already started on this, to read the code and the supporting documents. You might want to pull out specific new rules that are relevant to you. You might want to check the table of changes that we have to see, well, whenever we're running in it, whenever we're doing volunteer fundraising, we always look at these rules. What will the new rules be that we should look at when we're conducting volunteer fundraising? And then obviously you've come and joined one of these calls, so you're interested and you're getting informed through the other mechanisms that we're providing. So hopefully you would also make sure that all the key stakeholders in your organization are aware of what's going on and are preparing themselves for the new code. A lot of fundraisers have told us that they've had they often struggle to engage their trustees on these things. So I would say certainly think about, are the trustees or the governing body of the organization, are they aware that these changes are going on, and any additional support that you might need to make changes to your systems and your approaches. But also think about, do your partners know that it's coming? A lot of agencies or fundraising partner organizations aren't going to be as aware of what's going on within fundraising regulation as you people who are coming along to a specific webinar about it. So you may want to disseminate some of that information to them. You might want to share this presentation with them as well, so they can know what to expect. And during the time between now and November, you should be looking at updating your processes, whether that's agreements with partners, whether that's scripts for telephone fundraising, whether that's training materials. Also, you might want to look at, you'll want to think about, are your unstaffed collection methods up to the standards that are expected from the new code? And yeah, any policies that you have, anything that you've got internal or external that's referencing the code or that's referencing requirements of the code, that it is ready for what the new code says. And one of the best ways you can make sure that you're kept up to date on that stuff is to sign up for the newsletter. The QR code should work, but also if you go through the chat, you should be able to find a link where you can sign up to our newsletter, and that's when you'll find out if there's any more events coming up, if there's any more resources that are coming out, if there's blogs, if there's new guidance. That'll all be within our newsletter, so it's very useful for you to sign up for that.